Hi, I'm Shannon Albright, and I have a company called Miss Shannon Sewing. And I recently taught a class in Selma, Alabama, where I learned how to read and write. I noticed that there weren't many books in the library, so we're doing a book drive here in Los Angeles. And we're sending close to 500 books to Selma. One of the books that we're sending is one of my favorites. Growing up, our teachers would always read out loud to the children, to me when I was a child. And this is one of my favorites. So I'm going to start. I'm a little bit tired, so I'm just going to low-key read. Just going to read the first chapter. Okay, just to get kids excited about books and reading. Who knows, maybe I'll end up reading the whole book later. Okay, Lucy looks into a wardrobe. This is chapter 1. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them where they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready and 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty. But they do not come into the story very much. He himself was a very old man with shaggy white hair, which grew all over his face as well as his head. And they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little bit afraid of him. And Edmund, who was the next to the youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep on pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they had said goodnight to the professor and gone upstairs on the first night, the boys came into the girls' room and they talked it all over. "We've fallen on our feet." Excuse me. "We've fallen on our feet, and no mistake," said Peter. "This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like." "I think he's an old dear," said Susan. "Oh, come off it," said Edmund, who was tired and pretending not to be tired, which always makes him bad-tempered. "Don't go on talking like that." "Like what?" said Susan. Anyway, it's time you were in bed." "Trying to talk like mother," said Edmund. "And who are you going to say when I'm going to bed?" "Go to bed yourself." "Hadn't we all better go to bed?" said Lucy. "There's sure to be a row if we're heard talking here." "No, there won't," said Peter. "I tell you, this is the sort of house where no one's going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us. It's about a 10-minute walk down to the dining room, and any amount of stairs and passages in between." "What's that noise?" said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she had been in before. And the thought of all those long passages and rows of doors. I'm remembering this book. This is such a good book. Okay. All right, sorry. I'm going to start over. "What's that noise?" said Lucy suddenly. It was a very larger house than she had ever been in before. And the thought of all those long passages and rows of doors leading into empty rooms was beginning to make her feel a little creepy. "It's only a bird, silly," said Edmund. "It's an owl," said Peter. "This is going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now, I say. Let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a place like this. Did you see those mountains as we came along? And the woods? There might be eagles. There might be stags. There'll be hawks." "Badgers," said Lucy. "Foxes," said Edmund. "Rabbits," said Susan. But when next morning came, there was a steady rain falling, so thick that when you looked out the window, You could see neither mountains nor the woods or even the stream in the garden. Of course it would be raining, said Edmund. They had just finished their breakfast with the professor, and they were upstairs in the room he had set apart for them. What's interesting is that when I first heard this book, I was living in Texas, and then we moved to England. And so this book introduced England to me. So it's just, when you read, you can go to so many different places. Anyways, this is set in England, and England is like this magical, sort of scary place. But this book introduced me to England before I moved there. Don't stop grumbling, Ed, said Susan. 10 to 1, it'll clear up in an hour or so. And in the meantime, we're pretty well off. There's a wireless and a lot of books. Now, a wireless is a radio. It just has batteries. Not for me, said Peter. I'm going to explore in this house. Everyone agreed to this, and this is how the adventure began. It was the sort of house that you never seem to come to the end of, and it was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they tried led only into spare bedrooms, as everyone had expected they would. But soon they came to a very long room full of pictures, and they found a full suit of armor. And after that was a room all hung with green and a harp in one corner. And there came 3 steps down and 5 steps up, and then a kind of little upstairs hall and a door that led out onto a balcony, and then a whole series of rooms that led into each other and were lined with books, most of them very old books, and some bigger than a Bible in a church. And shortly after that, they looked into a room, and there was... Oh, this is it. Okay. And shortly after, they looked into a room that was quite empty except for one big wardrobe, the sort that had a looking glass in the door. There was nothing else in the room except a dead blue bottle on a windowsill. Okay. Nothing there, said Peter, and they all trooped out again except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worthwhile trying the door of the wardrobe. Even though she felt almost sure it would be locked, to her surprise it opened quite easily. 2 mothballs dropped out. Looking into the inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats and rubbed her face up against them, leaving the door open. Of course, because she knew it would be very foolish to shut oneself up into a wardrobe. Soon, she went further and found there was a second row of coats hanging behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her so as to not bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further in, then she took a step further in, then 2 or 3 steps, always expecting to find the woodwork against the tip of her fingers. So she's walking like this through the wardrobe and never found the back of it, but she could not feel it. This must be a simply enormous wardrobe, thought Lucy, still going further in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed there was something crunchy under her feet. I wonder, is that more mothballs, she thought, stooping down to feel it with her hand, but instead of feeling the hard, smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. This is very queer, she said, and went on a step or 2 further. Next moment she found that she was Next moment she found that what was rubbing against her face and hands were no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough and even prickly. "Why, it's just like branches of trees," exclaimed Lucy. And then she saw there was a light ahead of her, not a few inches away where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been, but a long way off. Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later she found she was standing in the middle of a wood at night time, with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little excited, but she felt very inquisitive. I'm getting a little overexcited about what's about to happen. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could see the open doorway of the wardrobe and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. She had, of course, left the door open, for she knew it was a very silly thing to shut oneself up into a wardrobe. It seemed to be daylight there. "I can always get back in if something goes wrong," thought Lucy. She began to walk forward, crunch, crunch over the snow, through the wood, through the other light. In about 10 minutes she reached it and found it was a lamppost. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamppost in the middle of a wood, and wondering what to do next, she heard the pitter-patter of feet coming towards her. And soon after that, there was a very strange person stepped out among the trees into the light of the lamppost. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. Oh my goodness. From the waist upward, he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. The hair on them were glossy black, and instead of feet, he had goat's hooves. He also had a tail, but Lucy didn't notice this at first because it was neatly caught up over the arm that held the umbrella, as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too, and he had a strange but pleasant little face, and a short pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella. In the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. With the parcels and the snow, it looked like he had been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a fawn. And when he saw Lucy, he gave her such a start of surprise he dropped all the parcels. "Goodness gracious me!" exclaimed the fawn. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is more about the fawn. So basically, these children walk through a wardrobe and have the most incredible adventure and meet all sorts of people, all sorts of animals. Oh, and Turkish delight. You'll learn about what Turkish delight is. So I just encourage you to read this book. It's just magical. It's one of the best books, especially just for your imagination.